Thank you for the prayer and the encouragement. We just sang the song, I Love to Tell the Story, and Mark, we're going through the book of Mark. Mark is telling the story of Jesus. So we're going to continue with Mark and how Is my mic going dead here? Might be going dead. Battery could be dead too, you know. Last week I talked about Jesus and his power. And there were lots of demonstrations of Jesus and his power, how he had power over diseases, to heal any disease. He had power to cast out demons and a lot of other things. And today the theme is Jesus and his disciples, which I think is kind of appropriate. It wasn't picked specifically for this week, but it kind of flowed in the line, and today is our AGM here, where we, his disciples, are doing business together. There were an awful lot of people who followed Jesus around the countryside. We think of the disciples being the 12, and those are the ones I'm talking about today. When I refer to disciples, I'm talking about the 12, but there were hundreds, sometimes thousands, who followed Jesus, who would have considered themselves disciples as such. But we'll see in a little bit how Jesus chooses 12 and names them his apostles, or as we say, his disciples. Now, this story is written by Mark. He was not one of the 12. I've said that already before, but I'm going to keep saying it. So an awful lot of the story that he tells, it happens in the context of Jesus and the 12. So Mark wasn't in that group. Where did he get his information? The assumption has been, since about the 2nd century, that Peter was the source. Peter's the one who sat down with Mark and said, so then we did this, and then we did this, and then Jesus said that, and then we did this. Some of those conversations come out in how Mark tells the story. And with the theme of Jesus and his disciples, Mark has a slightly different twist or flavor of the disciples than all the other, than Matthew or Luke or John do. And I'll be showing some scriptures to show that Mark it's a little more negative of the disciples. And that's what we're focusing on today, Mark's story of Jesus and his disciples. And the book is about Jesus. It's not about the disciples. So when we talk about the disciples, it's more to be a background for what Jesus was like. So we're going to start. Mark chapter 1, verse 16. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. At once they left their nets and followed him. So Jesus calls two, Simon and Andrew. When he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets without nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. So now he's got 4. All of them fishermen. Same lake, same seashore. They probably knew each other. They probably called out to each other across the water when they were fishing, and they probably talked to each other when they were back on the shore to see, so how'd you do? The way farmers talk with each other about farming. Chapter 2, verse 13. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. So Jesus calls a fifth disciple, also along the lake shore, also connected with the fishery, but totally opposite. He's not the guy that Peter and Andrew or James and John would, "So how did how was fishing today? How'd you do?" They would not talk to Matthew. Matthew was the guy who would be sitting in his booth as they came with the catch to sell in town, and he would say, "So, you got this and this much. This is how much money you owe me." He was the enemy. At least I'm sure some of the fishermen would have thought of him that way. And Jesus calls him. So right at the beginning, Jesus signals that this is not going to be a group where everybody thinks the same way and feels the same way about stuff. There's going to be some differences here. And I think it was quite intentional. Chapter 3. Verse 13, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12, designating them apostles, that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter; James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. How did they deserve this nickname?
Maybe they were spicy.
They probably were spicy. Yeah. To be sons of thunder, when we read the Bible, we read it, we put our own voice inflections in there. Or some of the movies or things we've watched, and somehow they have this certain, Jesus always talks calm and deep and all that. I wonder how it really sounded. You got two guys whose nicknames are Sons of Thunder. What in the world were they famous for? Where was I? Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot. There were two Simons. And Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So those are the 12. A group of 12 who would have a special place with Jesus, as he says in verse 14, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. They were set apart from all the others who followed him and would call themselves followers or disciples of Jesus. And it includes Judas, in brackets, who betrayed him. Did Jesus intentionally invite Judas to be a disciple because he wanted one of his own to betray him? Did Jesus engineer his own arrest and crucifixion? In my opinion, no, absolutely not. Judas chose to do this. And even though Jesus knew all along what would happen, he still gives Judas every opportunity and every chance the others had. He extended just as much grace to Judas as to any of the others. Judas made his choice. When you and I sin, we do so by our choice, not because God somehow made us do it or because the devil somehow made us do it. It's our choice. It was Judas' choice, and it's ours. So now Jesus has these 12 disciples, besides the many others who followed him. So let's look at some of the instances where Mark describes these disciples. And we're going to go through a number of different parts here. Mark chapter 4, verse 1 to 9. Jesus is teaching beside the lake, and he tells this parable of a sower. Listen, a farmer went out to sow his seed, and he was scattering the seed, and describes these four places where the seed fell and what it means. And then verse 10. When he was alone, the 12 and the others around him asked him about the parables. In other words, what were you talking about out there? He told them, verse 11, the secret of the kingdom of God has been given to you, but to those on the outside, everything is said in parables, so that they may be ever seeing but never perceiving, and ever hearing but never understanding. Otherwise, they might turn and be forgiven. Verse 13, then Jesus said to them, don't you understand this parable? How then will you understand any parable? Does he sound a little frustrated? Come on, guys. If you don't get this is pretty simple. There's bigger stuff coming. If you don't get this one, how are you going to get anything? So Mark, in his recording of this, and I'm assuming it came from Peter, Mark points out that Jesus says, you don't get it? Chapter 4, same chapter, verse 35. They go across the lake again. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, let's go to the other side, leaving the crowd behind. They took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and he said to them, teacher, don't you care if we drown? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, quiet, be still. Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And then Mark records, he said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Again, it sounds like Jesus is a little frustrated. Maybe not. Again, we read our tone of voice into it. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? Chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 21. Here, Jesus, they go across the lake again. And when they get to shore, somebody comes and says, can you come to my house and heal my little girl? She's terribly sick. She's dying. And on the way, there's a crowd around him. They're all following and whatever. Some because they really want to hear what he has to say, and some because they're just curious what's going to happen next. And a woman crowds her way into this throng and touches him. And she is healed immediately. Verse 30 in chapter 5, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? And his disciples say, you see the people crowding against you, and yet you ask who touched me? Kind of logical, but only logical when you don't know Jesus. And these guys had been with him now for a while. They should have known, okay, he's got some reason for asking this question. And yet they come at it straight. Come on, man, there's people all over the place. They're crowding against you. How can you say who touched me? We're all touching you. Mark points that out. Chapter 6, starting in verse 32. He's on the shore, he's feeding these 5,000 people, and the disciples get into the boat and they fight the wind, And Jesus comes out to them walking on the water. And then in verse 49 of chapter 6, if I can find that. We'll start in verse 48. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when he saw them walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Why does Mark put that in there? They hadn't understood this first miracle about the feeding of the 5,000, and their hearts were hard. So Mark, in his description of the disciples, they're still not getting it. In fact, their hearts were hard, not just dense, but hard. If Peter is the one who's been telling Mark this story, and I don't know how many years later it would have been when Peter was telling Mark, what was it that Peter by then had understood that he realized here they hadn't got because they were hard? Mark chapter 7, verse 14. If I can find that. Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a man." He had just been questioned by some Pharisees about some of their rules and stuff. And Jesus is saying, it's not the things outside of you that make you unclean. It's what comes out of us that makes us unclean. So then, after he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. And listen to what he says in verse 18. "Are you so dull?" What does that feel like? This is your master. This is your teacher, your rabbi. You're following him. You've put aside everything else just to follow him. "Are you so dull?" he says. Again, Peter remembers this. And he points it out. And Mark records it. A different translation says, "Then are you also without understanding?" Maybe also including them and the Pharisees who have been questioning him. But again, just that statement, "Are you so dull?" Don't you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? Chapter 8. During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat." And again, another miracle of feeding 4,000 this time. And then they get into the boat and they go across to the other side, and some Pharisees come and they ask Jesus for a sign. They want, "Come on, show us something to prove that you are the Messiah." And then they get into the boat and they cross the lake again. And then, while they're crossing this other direction, they went back and forth across that lake so many different directions and so many times. Chapter 8, verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." Now the Pharisees had been saying, "Come on, show us a sign. Prove to us that you are who you think you are." And Jesus says, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." They discussed this with one another and said, It's because we have no bread. I don't get the connection. Well, he said something about yeast. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. It's because we have no bread. Aware of of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the loaves?" And he goes on. This is more than just, "Are you so dull?" or "Do you still not have faith?" It's, come on, guys. Do you have eyes but you can't see? Do you have ears but you can't hear? Don't you remember? What are you not getting here? And again, I don't know his tone of voice. Chapter 9. In chapter 9, starting in verse 2, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up on a high mountain where they were all alone. And this is the experience where Jesus is transfigured. His clothes became dazzling white. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter says to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And then verse 6 in brackets, he did not know what to say. They were so frightened. You ever do that? I have no idea what to say, so I'll just talk. Plato, Greek philosopher, says, "Wise men speak because they have something to say. Fools because they have to say something." Peter points this out to Mark. Mark wasn't there on the mountain. Peter points out, "I said, Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And then he turns to Mark and he says, "I didn't know what to say. I was terrified. So why did you say anything?" Again, the picture that Mark paints of these disciples is not terribly flattering. They don't show up like being a bunch of really, really smart, high achievers. They were not the top of the class when they graduated. So these are the disciples that Jesus called. Some examples that Mark paints that some of the other writers don't do quite in the same way. You think Jesus ever said halfway through, "Oh my goodness, I should have called somebody else. God, is it too late to start over?" Or you think, I don't think so. Mark tells the story of disciples who just didn't catch on. And if it's true that he got his information from Peter, how is it that Peter remembers those things so well? When you tell the story of your past, how do you tell it? There's a t-shirt. The older I get, the better I was. Is that how you tell your story? You know, man, I remember that time I was playing hockey and I scored the winning, How do you tell, or do you tell only the times where you really, really messed up? How do you tell your history? Some people replay only the great times, and others replay only the disasters. It has to do with what we're focusing on. Neither one is healthy. I think for Peter it was different. It's not that he was just, we were such a bunch of losers. We did this wrong and this. I don't think that's the case for Peter. He did remember, and Mark recorded, the times where he and the other 11 were really slow to catch on. But the purpose of writing the story of Jesus is not to write the story of a bunch of dumb disciples. The purpose is to describe Jesus as chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel, the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So then why tell us about all the things the disciples didn't get? If it's a backdrop, if the disciples act as a backdrop to show us what Jesus was really like, well, then the one thing that I see is Jesus did not give up on people who fail. People who were, do you still not get it? Are you still so dull? He never gave up on them. He never said, oh, okay, forget it, I'm going to find another 12. He never gave up. He knew all along that Judas would betray him, and yet he extended to Judas every grace that he extended to the others. He knew ahead of time that Peter would deny him. So I imagine Peter and Mark sitting there somewhere years later. And Peter is telling Mark these stories. And I don't know if Mark is writing down as they go or doing it later. And somewhere in that story, Peter gets to the part of the story where Jesus and his disciples ate their traditional Passover meal. And Jesus had already told them a number of times he would be betrayed and arrested and put on trial and crucified, but they still hadn't quite got that either. And then Jesus initiates what we call the Lord's Supper or communion. And then Jesus tells them again that he will be arrested and they will all run away. And Peter says, even if all fall away, I will not. That's in Mark chapter 14. And Jesus says to Peter, I tell you the truth, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. And Peter says, no, wait, that's not going to happen. And then Peter tells Mark the story of Jesus being arrested in the garden and put on trial, and Peter being in the courtyard watching from a distance. And 3 times somebody comes to him and says, you're one of his disciples, aren't you? And 3 times he says, absolutely not, I don't know him. Can you imagine the emotion in the room between Peter and Mark as he's telling Mark that story? The main point, I think, that Peter is making with all these stories is not to show how clumsy the disciples were, but it's to show Mark and us something about Jesus. Including the fact that later on, after Peter denied knowing Jesus and after Jesus died and rose again, Jesus still made a point of telling Peter, you still have a place in my work. So that's one of the things, one of the takeaways from this. These disciples who just didn't get it over and over and over, they didn't get it. Jesus doesn't give up on people who are slow to get it. I'm glad for that. I'm slow to get it. The second takeaway for me, there is a place for you and me with Jesus. If you don't catch on as quick as you wish, or when you fail, like Peter, remember that doesn't disqualify you to be a disciple. Jesus doesn't say, oh, forget them. I'm going to go find somebody else. And then one more. Reading about the disciples being rather dense and how Jesus never expelled them. I think it's a reminder that when we look around in our own gathering or in our circle of friends or the larger community or wherever, and you see somebody else who's, boy, how come they don't get it yet? They should know better than that already. Maybe we can take a lesson from that as well, to be as gracious with others as Jesus is with you and me. 3 takeaways. Jesus doesn't give up on people. Jesus doesn't give up on you and me. And we shouldn't give up on each other. So Jesus and his disciples, I think we also would consider ourselves to be disciples, to be followers. Let us continue to follow, to look for understanding, and to be gracious and patient with each other and with ourselves. Let's pray. Father, as we continue looking at the story that Mark tells of your Son, guide us in understanding, in learning, in remembering things that we've already heard, but hearing them again. Continue to remind us of the story of Jesus, what he is, what he was, and what he yet shall be. In Jesus' name, amen.